So much to discuss. Let's bring in our guests for today. From London, we're joined by Mahsa Ali-Madani, who's an internet researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute. From Preston, Lancashire, Amy Binns is senior lecturer in digital journalism at the University of Central Lancashire. And in London, Tim Squirrell, head of communications and editorial at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Welcome to you all. Mahsa, let's start with you. Are Meta's changes to its hate speech policy here a perfectly reasonable reaction to Russia's actions in Ukraine, or something chillingly dangerous? Tim, I could see you nodding there. Is Meta effectively saying here that it's perfectly reasonable, it's okay to single out people from one country and one country alone, and gives them the green light for what amounts to hate speech? What are the implications of that?
I think the difficulty here is that this is being reported as a result of a single leak, of a single carve-out. And Facebook, Meta, has historically been extremely inconsistent in enforcing its policies across different regions. They've recently become a little bit better into the Western world and English-speaking world at enforcing these policies. But if you look at, for example, my organization's research in the MENA region, you can see that when it comes to non-English speaking spaces, incitement to violence is one of the things that happens quite a lot, but there are a multitude of sins which occur unchecked in these spaces. So it's not necessarily the case that this is the only exception. And also what we know is that the more complicated the policy and the more carve-outs they create, the more temporary measures they create, the harder it's going to be to consistently enforce that in a way that's actually fair to all of its users.
Tim, I can see you nodding. Perhaps you want to come in on that, but let me put something to you here. Donald Trump remains banned from Twitter and Facebook for inciting violence ahead of the Capitol riot in Washington, D.C. in January 2021. And here we have Facebook and Instagram saying that it's fine to incite violence against Vladimir Putin and Russian soldiers. I mean, how do we explain the double standards there?
I think the crucial thing here isn't necessarily just the double standard, but again, the lack of scrutiny and lack of regulation that Facebook and other social media companies are subject to here. So we know that there are enormous problems on these platforms: misinformation, weaponized hatred, disinformation, extremism, calls for incitement to violence. These are running rampant across these spaces, and that's just from the relatively limited picture of the information that we do have. The fact is that Meta and other social media platforms just are not subject to the same degree of transparency regulations that they should be. And so we don't get to know the extent of the problems, and therefore we don't get to know why they're making policies in one space and not in another. So we don't know what this particular policy is in response to. And really what matters is that in the regulations that are forthcoming in the UK, in the EU, in Australia, we need to have requirements for Facebook, for Instagram, for all of the other companies to be transparent with their data and allow researchers access to it so we can see what's actually going on and how they're affecting society. They have a massive power and they have basically no responsibility to go with it.
Mahsa.
So it may well be the case that Facebook is a cynical actor here, but I think the more cynical actor is critically the Kremlin. This is probably a policy that they wanted to pursue anyway. They've been trying to essentially militate against Facebook from the early days of this conflict, when Facebook started fact-checking some of their state-run media organizations. And so this has given them absolutely an excuse to do it probably earlier than they would have done. But they were already looking for a reason to shutter Facebook and similar outlets where you can gain access to information which doesn't come from pro-Kremlin sources in Russia. So they are effectively trying to win the information war on the ground with their own people by shuttering independent media, by restricting access to social media platforms where you might be exposed to some other ideas that aren't pro-Kremlin narratives, and allowing to continue operating places like Telegram, where RT and Sputnik and other Russian state-owned media operations have a massive footprint and where they're able to spread disinformation without much fear of regulation.
On that note, Tim, about the switched-on population, I just want to get your thoughts on how Ukraine's president is doing with his use of social media. To what extent is he leaving President Putin looking old and out of touch with the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky is everywhere on social media right now?
I think we have to bear in mind that Volodymyr Zelensky may be everywhere on social media in the West, but this isn't a fight that is just being won or fought in the West. It's also one that crucially has been fought domestically in Russia, because this invasion can only continue so long as Putin remains popular and so long as, the body bags don't start coming back in such a high level that Russia has to think again about what it's doing. So it may be that Zelensky is very popular here and his social media game is pretty strong. But in addition to that, we're seeing that Putin is continuing to create a stranglehold on information in Russia. But I also think that the Russian propaganda game, or the Kremlin propaganda game here, is again also quite strong. So you can see, for example, in response to this latest thing from Meta, that Russia is, or the Kremlin is pushing the hashtag Russian Lives Matter, which is a cynical repurposing of a social justice slogan from sort of Western social justice movements, to try to make the claim that Russians and Russian speakers are being victimized both in Ukraine and elsewhere. And that was part of the narrative, or the justification that Putin gave for the war in the first place. So it may be the case that Ukraine is putting up a pretty strong fight in the propaganda war, but I wouldn't count the Kremlin out yet.
OK. There, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Fascinating discussion. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Mahsa Ali Madani, Amy Binns and Tim Squirrell, thanks very much indeed.